Texas's workforce. They teach us. They inspire us. They take us to new heights. They make the things that make our lives better and open doors to a brighter tomorrow. These aren't just workers doing a job. They're people doing a job well. They keep Texas running, and that matters to you, and it matters to us. We're Texas Mutual Insurance Company, the state's #1 workers' comp provider. Every day, we're on the job with 1.5 million Texas workers. And every day, we have the same goal, getting each and every one of them home safe to their families. With safety resources, training technologies, dividends, and a total commitment to service, Texas Mutual is changing the way workers' comp works for you.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the 2021 Texas Soccer Summit presented by the Striker Texas. This hour of the conference is brought to you by Texas Mutual Insurance Company, the state's #1 workers' comp provider, serving 70,000 policyholders and protecting more than 1.5 million Texans on the job each day. Texas Mutual focuses exclusively on workers' comp coverage for Texas businesses. Their mission is to provide a strong foundation for the businesses that rely on them, take care of Texas's workforce, and building stronger, safer communities. My name is Chris Bils, and I'm the co-founder and senior writer for the Striker Texas, a new soccer media outlet covering the sport across the Lone Star State. Today, I'm hosting the first panel of many as part of the 2021 Texas Soccer Summit. How to make soccer relevant in mainstream media. And joining me on today's panel are Tommy Magelssen from the Dallas Morning News, Jason Jarrett, the sports editor at the Austin American-Statesman, David Nuno, sports anchor and reporter for ABC 13 in Houston, and Johanna Gretschel, the managing editor for the Striker Texas. Hi, everybody, welcome in. And I just wanted to start out and thank all of you for joining us for this. And I know each of us are soccer fans, and we're all leaders in our newsrooms. But since you're fans of soccer in your personal lives, I thought it'd be fun to kind of start out with early memories of the sport and your story of getting into soccer and how media coverage played a role in that. So, Jason, yours kind of maybe goes back a little farther than others. Tell me about your experiences of getting into soccer and how media played a role.
So it goes back to the 70s. I grew up in Dallas, played youth soccer, club soccer, all the way up through high school there. But my first memories of getting into soccer were watching the Dallas Tornado play. It's an NASL team, a bunch of young guys on that team, including Kyle Rote Jr., Steve Petcher, Kenny Cooper. And those are the names that, I remembered and started watching from the age of 5 on. Used to go down to O&B Stadium, which is SMU's old football field, watch a team play there, went to all their youth camps. Really at the time, ironically, there wasn't much media around it. I grew up in a household, my dad was the editor and managing editor of the Dallas Times-Herald at the time, and it wasn't in the paper a lot. I was a huge Cowboys fan. I was a huge Rangers fan. We didn't have a basketball team at that time. But because I was completely engulfed in the sport from a personal level, tickets were cheap to get into the Tornado compared to getting into a Cowboys game. That's where we used to go. I used to go to all the Dallas Sidekicks game, which is the indoor team. I don't know if they still exist in some form in the Dallas area. Maybe Tommy could answer that. But
shout out to Scott Wagner.
Yeah, they used to play at Reunion Arena, 13,000 crowd at Reunion. Tattoo was obviously a hero of mine in teenage years. And, I always tell the story about soccer is we used to scalp tickets for the Sidekicks. I had a buddy who had season tickets, and we could sell them for twice the price before we walked into the game. So mine goes all the way back. I'm a huge soccer fan. Now I'm an Arsenal fan, huge men's national team fan. So I've kind of just grown up with it.
Yeah, no, that's an awesome story, and a lot of it goes back to Dallas. Tommy, what are your early memories of getting into soccer, and how has media coverage kind of shaped that?
Sure. So, like I think a lot of people on this panel or even viewers, I grew up playing soccer, and I really got into it during the 2002 World Cup. I was in middle school, and so it was kind of, prime time for me to kind of be expanding some of my cultural horizons. But I did not really become into professional soccer until about a decade ago when I was in college. And it was as the Premier League started to really expand into the U.S. market, it made it easier than ever to watch games. So I became a big Tottenham fan. So I'm going to send Jason some hate mail here in a little bit. It did coincide a little bit with Clint Dempsey going to the team. I think that's probably how a lot of Americans can probably relate to certain teams overseas. But now my fandom has grown so much that Tottenham is really the only team professionally that I'll really support. And it's because we don't cover the Premier League, obviously, here in Dallas. It's easy for me to get my fandom that way, and it's easier than ever to take in any soccer league in the world, thanks to streaming services that have come about in the last 5 years, as well as dedicated media services like the Striker. So it's only really grown over the last decade.
Awesome. What about you, David? Looks like we can't hear David, but Johanna, you want to take over for a second until we get him back?
Yeah, sure. Can you guys hear me well?
Yeah, we can
Yeah,
hear you great.
okay. Yeah, so I played soccer growing up like a lot of people. And I kind of feel like I was the perfect age to really get excited about that 1999 Women's World Cup because I was 9 years old in 1999. So, and 9 is kind of that age where kids haven't like specialized in other sports yet. So a lot of kids my age were playing soccer. And I guess to that point, obviously the NBA was always on in my house. NFL was always on. Maryland basketball was always on. I grew up in Maryland. But I never really saw women represented in pro sports or really sports fandom at all. And so to see the whole country get really excited about the Women's World Cup. And at the time, I grew up in the DC area, excuse me. And I loved reading like the Washington Post sports pages every day. So they had a ton of coverage of the games. And I definitely feel like media coverage of the event, I mean, I think as everybody knows, that the Women's World Cup that year really kind of brought women's soccer to the forefront, right? So I think definitely the way that media really engaged with the sport with the World Cup that year got me really excited about the sport because it was the one women's sport that seemed to get any coverage at all, honestly. And then I do feel like a couple years later was when like Bend It Like Beckham came out. And again, it was sort of this like cultural phenomenon where everyone was talking about it, everyone's seen it. One of these few like female depictions in sports. And that wasn't even pro sports. I think they were like a college team or like a low level team depicted in the movie. But I definitely found, and at the time I loved, it became my main sport. And I think part of that is because, I saw Brandy Chastain on the cover of Sports Illustrated, and I had their posters up all over my room. And it was something that was just available for young girls to get excited about.
Yeah. David, do we have you? Looks like we still don't have David, but yeah, I hear a lot about World Cups. We've got, Premier League coverage with NBC and Jason kind of going back, ways, talking about, getting into the sport. And I just think, it's really interesting to think about how media coverage and how, what teams were able to be absorbed into, Jason was talking about Arsenal, just kind of shape, how we kind of perceive and get into soccer. And let's transition now to the local coverage and talk about, how each of you cover soccer in your newsrooms. And I guess maybe Tommy, we'll start with you up in Dallas. I know Dallas gets a ton of international games
You guys got me?
every summer. Yeah, we've got
yeah.
David now. So
Awesome.
there we
Goodness gracious. The internet's
Yeah,
great,
here we
right,
go.
guys?
wouldn't be COVID times without a little technical gremlins. So yeah, David, do you want to fill us in on
Sure.
your early experiences?
Yeah, so I didn't grow up loving soccer. In fact, I did not like the sport at all as a kid growing up in Alief, Texas, here in Houston. And it wasn't until I got my first sports job that I fell in love with the sport. I was working for the Dallas Mavericks at the time, and an opportunity came with the San Diego Sockers, which was the Sidekicks' big rival, and I was their director of PR. And and I was, how old was I at that point? 26 years old. So I had joined in late. And that's where it kind of started for me, and became friends with the players, saw the love for the sport. I know Tattoo well from those days. The Sockers were a big rival to them. Fast forward a couple years later, I'm doing sideline reporting for the Dynamo, and just watching Dominic Kinnear, the head coach at that time, work, just kind of really started pushing my interest. But it wasn't until my kids started playing youth soccer that it took a huge turn to where, like, this is what we watch on Saturday mornings, Real Madrid every Saturday and Sunday, and the EL and the Dynamo in the evening. It really took my kids' interest in it for me to just make it my main sport. But like I said, like, I grew up not liking it, and now that's really the main sport that I watch.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think it's interesting to see everybody's stories of how they got into soccer. For me, it was the 2006 World Cup, and just kind of became obsessed from that point forward. And like Tommy said, Premier League and all the World Cups after that. But let's talk about the local game and the local coverage. And Tommy, how is soccer covered at the Dallas Morning News?
Sure, yeah, and you mentioned international games coming to the DFW area, particularly in Arlington. The most popular team, bar none, in DFW is the Mexican men's national team. And so whenever they're in town, we do like to cover them. And of course, we're trying to do more with trend stories as opposed to, of course, just, hey, they're in town, here's how you can get a ticket if you can get a ticket. So our coverage, it's funny, I've got old papers from the 90s. We've had huge special sections, of course, obviously for the 94 World Cup, but it's definitely changed over the last, 25 years. I started here in 2013. And since I've been here, we basically had dedicated freelancers to cover FC Dallas. And then we'll do bigger picture trend stories from a staff perspective or a freelance perspective. When we can have, an expert level freelancer, we've used John Arnold in the past, who's now with the Striker. So our coverage really does kind of zero in on FC Dallas as well as national team when they're in DFW, and bigger picture trend stories that we might be able to tell. There's now a second indoor team in DFW, so we did a piece on them about, 18 months ago. And so we try to hit those trends. But again, the most popular team is definitely the Mexican national team when they're in town.
Yeah, for sure. And David, what's it look down there in Houston with ABC 13?
Yeah, I would say it's exactly what Tommy is saying, that the Mexican national team is the top dog when it comes to soccer. U.S. men's national team obviously carries a lot of weight, as does the U.S. women's team. But with us, it's about dividing time, and we only have typically, let's say, a sportscast, 3 minutes to tell the story. So, and that's a lot of stories we got to get in: NFL, NBA, Mexican national team if they're in town, whatever it may be. So that's the hard part for us when you're talking about how we cover it. But without a doubt, Mexican national team is here. We're going to try to go live. We're going to try to be all over it. And I wish we had the same kind of emphasis when it came to the Dynamo, but it's just not there from a time / fan perspective at the moment.
Yeah. And Jason, I know with Austin FC coming into town, it's an exciting time. I've been involved with the coverage with the Statesman for the last few years, but what is it like, when a new team comes into town, and how does that soccer coverage, how do you see it kind of fitting into the newsroom and the news coverage? I know it's still things we're trying to figure out, but how does soccer compare to the Longhorn or something that's established like that? What's kind of how is that process of putting a new team into the market?
It's a good question. So I think you know here in Austin, Texas will be always the 100-foot gorilla, 100-pound gorilla in the room, and it'd be tough to really outsize any coverage we have on that, especially the football team. But with that said, this is the shiny new object in the room, and ever since you're gonna tell me if I get this wrong, October 18th, 2017, is that right? It became a big deal for us. MLS became a big deal for us. This is the first professional team in the city. There's a lot of not only sport buzz around it, but just kind of buzz in general, entertainment, city politics. So it became a big story for us. And I feel like, that's something that I've been aware of in cities like Orlando and cities like Nashville, where those initial, in Atlanta, I know a lot of people at the AJC. This is a big deal for this city. This, opportunity for the Statesman and other news entities, whether it's you guys or TV stations, just to kind of ride the wave and tell the story of not only the team but the league and the sport. So I mean, we've got I think you wrote the story, or maybe it was Kevin wrote the story about how the Women's World Cup, TV ratings, Austin was the #1 market. So there is some sort of taste for soccer, and we're just trying to figure that out.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, the idea of these local teams in these markets. I mean, I hear Tommy and David talking a lot about the Mexican national team, the U.S. national team, and FC Dallas and Houston Dynamo and the Dash are there as well. And Jason with Austin FC, coming into town, we think it's going to be a bigger deal. But I think all of those things, kind of led to the formation of the Striker Texas. And Johanna, why don't you kind of break down, how we kind of fit into the picture and how we're trying to cover soccer at maybe a different level and toward a, maybe different audience or a section of the audience that each of these outlets kind of reach.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, obviously when, we're talking about traditional news organizations that are reaching this broader audience like that you guys are serving, there only is so much space, right? And so sort of the beauty of being a new digital media company is we can meet the fans where they are. There's the giving space to the sport, and then I think there's also talking to the fans and acknowledging their knowledge level of the sport. You can write things that don't have to explain, the starting 11 or the 9. You can write things directly to the fans, to the people who are already the hardcore fans. And I think one of the challenges too of writing about sports in the mainstream press is kind of giving that basic explanations for things that hardcore people already understand. So I think in addition to giving the sport the space that it deserves, we're also able to meet people where they are and give people something that they're already really intense about. I mean, it was really cool to hear Jason and David saying that their first interest in soccer was sort of connected to the indoor teams. And that I feel like that seemed unusual to me at first, but I think it also just shows you can get really interested at the local level in whatever league you have. I've worked in a lot of mainstream newsrooms before. I used to work with Jason and Chris, obviously, at the Statesman. And one of my first jobs out of college, I worked at the Times-Picayune in New Orleans, Louisiana. And that actually was a cool example of a time where it was a World Cup year, I believe 2014. And that summer, we had an NPSL team in New Orleans. And that summer, the sports editor assigned me to do some local stories on the NPSL team to sort of ride that wave of World Cup popularity and people being more interested in soccer. And it was honestly a hit. It was a lot of fun for me to go to the games, interact with the players. And people do get more interested, I think, in soccer when it's connected to this larger global phenomenon. But yeah, I think for us, it's great to have a separate platform where we can do these in-depth things that really speak to the fans, covering not only MLS, but we actually do, Jason, I'm not sure if you know this, but we do have a contributor, Scott Wegner, who is going to be writing about the Dallas Sidekicks, which I think is pretty cool and something you really won't find anywhere else, right? Yeah, pick it up. Yeah, so, and we'll be able to address the USL teams, and obviously the Dash being the only NWSL team in Texas right now. So I think our approach it's a little bit different than what you can do in a mainstream press, but there's obviously a lot of different ways to approach coverage of the sport and getting people more interested in the sport. And now that I'm rambling, I feel like I forgot the original question, but hopefully that answers what you asked.
No, that was great. That was great, Johanna. Yeah. And I think it kind of goes back to, this, elephant in the room in Texas, which is, obviously, football it takes up a lot of space, and these other sports that have been traditionally around for years, and the challenges that the media companies have of, staffing and things like that. I guess Tommy, David, Jason, whoever wants to take this first, but what are sort of the challenges? What's keeping mainstream media outlets from covering soccer, and specifically local soccer teams in MLS and NWSL, the way that the Dallas Cowboys and the Houston Astros and the Texas Longhorns are covered in those markets? How do you kind of fill that gap? How can we help soccer fill that gap? Yeah.
Success is part of it. All right. So I go back to when the Astros weren't very good. We didn't cover the Astros as like we did the World Series run, right? It's the intensity changes depending on success. And also the amount of coverage depends on the people that are going to the games. If the Dynamo are struggling to get people at the games, if the Dash are struggling to get people at the games, if people are not retweeting my stories on the Dynamo and not getting likes or showing any traction, it becomes harder and harder to go after those stories all the time. My job is to tell good stories, right? So I look for soccer stories, but I don't think it's my job to, grow the sport of soccer. That being said, I'm always looking for opportunities. So, and I think we have a great PR staff here in Houston with the Dynamo who do feed me great ideas, and that's part of it. But I also think that since soccer is so fragmented and people have so many different areas to go, the local TV guy, they don't really come to me. When I tweet about Ronaldo being 36 and having the most goals ever, I get 3 likes. But if I were a soccer-specific site, that would probably get like thousands, right? So I just don't think that audience comes to television for that. So if we could kind of shift that for those who do provide that service, I think it would go a long way.
Yeah, it's a great point. Tommy, what do you think about the challenges that FC Dallas faces getting coverage in a platform like yours, where it's you're focused on everything?
Yeah, that's always kind of the challenge. I think that if I had a blank check, I would hire 2 soccer writers and a columnist tomorrow, and I'm sure Jason would be in a similar boat. Maybe I'd pocket some of that money as well. But we're obviously in a very difficult media environment, and it becomes very difficult to pick and choose what you're covering. And like David said a few moments ago and earlier, it really is about kind of what is that engagement, what are the fans looking for. And if FC Dallas were on a hot streak and if they were selling out every single game, we would increase our coverage correspondingly. And we have so many metrics to kind of help show what does well, what doesn't do well. And it's also along the same lines of it's tougher to parachute in on certain things if you're not already kind of being that authoritative figure, which is why I'm excited about the Striker, because everyone who goes to the Striker website knows what it's getting. If you go to dallasnews.com, a lot of those people are probably just there for Cowboys, and a lot of them probably aren't from North Texas. And so it becomes very difficult to kind of juggle that. But obviously, the Cowboys are, they like to call themselves America's team still. And there's a just incredible amount of interest in so many teams here in DFW. But our high school strategy is kind of like when teams are good, we'll cover them more, and they kind of expect that. And when you have 150 plus teams in your coverage area, there's always good teams. FC Dallas, while it has been, I'd say, among the better teams in the Western Conference, hasn't quite gotten to the level of others. And I think, like we've seen with the Stars and some of their runs, when that run increases, the media attention increases. And so we'd love to be able to devote more resources to FC Dallas, but they're very understanding of what they're competing against. And again, it's just very difficult. But it's also very rewarding when we can tell some of those great stories. And like the Dynamo, the FC Dallas PR staff does do a good job of making sure that these good stories can find an avenue with us.
For sure. Yeah, and Jason, I want to come back to you in a minute, but I think, something that David said, I think would be good for Johanna to sort of talk about real quick, which is like David said, it's not his job to grow the sport of soccer, right? And I think that's totally fair. I think that's valid. But I think at the Striker Texas, that is sort of part of our mission, right? And I don't know, I can speak to it as well, but Johanna, how do we draw that line as the Striker Texas of supporting the growth of a sport while also covering it fairly, and I think it's part of our mission, and it's part of something that we can do that's a little bit different than the challenges that we're hearing from each of these three other outlets.
Yeah, definitely. I think being able to grow the sport of soccer is something that we return to over and over again when we're first putting the Striker Texas together, right? It's definitely one of the goals of the website and the point of creating an entire platform around one sport where, as has been mentioned, there's not always the most vocal fans for some of these teams, but I think we're trying to take it upon ourselves to put more content out there about these teams, and by doing that, creating more fans of the sport. I think too, it can be a pretty fine line between reporting and cheerleading sometimes, because we do want to be proponents of the sport, but we also want to be serious journalists. And sometimes that might mean disagreeing with the decision that people in the front office of an MLS team have made. And you along with John and Victor, I think, and all of our contributors are going to have full range to criticize certain teams if they want to, but at the same time, on social, we do want to be really encouraging of these teams, especially, for example, just during the draft that just happened, giving these athletes shout outs who may not have the most Twitter followers, and even the teams they've gotten picked up by might not have the most Twitter followers. So I think one of our strategies in social and on our site is sort of giving shout outs, shining more of a spotlight. One thing I think David mentioned that I always think about too is like, not everyone in the world is on social media, and like it can be really hard to get out of that mindset of like, okay, obviously if I'm tweeting about the NFL, it's going to get way more retweets and likes, right? Like the social metrics are way more than if I'm tweeting about a soccer team. And that can be really hard, and you're covering all sports, so that makes sense to prioritize your focus that way. But I think when we're trying to create more sports of smaller teams, I think we kind of just have to blindly keep putting content out. Maybe certain smaller teams aren't going to get a lot of social engagement, but I think we're sort of experimenting right now about creating more fans, and we're going to keep putting it out, and maybe that helps somebody tomorrow hear of this team for the first time, and I think then we've accomplished our goal.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's awesome, and I think that kind of segues. And Jason, it's been interesting. We talked. You touched on this a little bit earlier. This idea that I've been living through too of watching this new team come into a market that with an established sports culture, and I think the mainstream media in Austin, being the TV stations, the Statesman, everybody's been sort of trying to figure out how big this thing's actually going to be. And I think that, some of the numbers speak for themselves so far, but we're not really going to know until, the first kickoff and how things kind of resonate. But, how much of that falls on the Statesman, which is reporting, on the city as a whole and the city's culture, when a new team or league comes along, is it the responsibility of the media to give a certain level of coverage, or how much of that kind of responsibility falls on the team and its fans to earn that, whatever that means. And I think that, Dallas and Houston have sort of their own stories of that as well, that I want to get into as well. But, I know it's kind of a deep question, maybe, kind of take baby steps into the pool and then we can kind of break it open again a little bit. But, what do you think, Jason?
That's a good question. We have a I'll go back to what David was talking about. We have a responsibility in any media outlet of telling good stories. And
right.
So it comes down to, especially now in a digital age, if they're not reading the story, then why would somebody subscribe? Why would somebody pay for it, right? The story of Austin FC, especially from the beginning till now, until, April, whenever this team kicks, and the whole year, this is a story that, from everybody I talk to, from people my parents' age, which are the late 70s, to, my kids' friends wearing Austin FC t-shirts, everybody's talking about it. So there is a responsibility from my media company to tell the stories that people want to read and are interested in. And I see folks, 70 years apart talking about it, whether it's, why are they giving all this land to the team and telling that story, which we've told over and over, to the kid who just wants to buy the nearest jersey, the latest Legends jersey with, that he'll wear to school the next day so all of his buddies will see. There are, and you and I've had this conversation before, for every one really good story we get to, there are 10 or 12 we just can't get to. And so I feel like there is just so much there that we can bite off on that we haven't told yet.
Right. Yeah, and like the story of soccer in Houston and Dallas, Dallas was, the Burnwood teams, and, MLS was maybe more of a minor league at that point, even though it is Major League Soccer, by name, it's really kind of vaulted itself up into that stratosphere of late. So, Tommy, how does, what do you think of that question? How does FC Dallas sort of earn its seat at the table? And what does it still have to do, I guess, to be talked about, not just with you guys, but on talk radio and stuff like that, in the same circles as, the Stars and the Mavs and the Cowboys?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to, winning cures all. Rangers won't be doing a lot of winning this year. But winning cures all, as well as kind of developing an identity. FC Dallas has a fantastic identity of developing young players who can then go on to stardom, potentially in other leagues. And I think that's difficult for some traditional sports fans to kind of recognize and appreciate, where you're used to maybe grooming a young player and then having them become your star, your all-star. Everyone in Dallas is used to Dirk Nowitzki spending his entire career here, Emmitt Smith having most of his career here, things like that. And so FCD has cultivated this, and I think they've done a better job the last couple of years really pitching that. They had some recent high-profile transfers, of course, with Brian Reynolds, Reggie Cannon. And so continuing to allow people to kind of understand that, and that it's that is a successful team, really, because you can develop players and national team stars. I think that can help. I know FCD has sometimes struggled to bring in, big name national talent players, not necessarily through like ownership or leadership's fault. That's just kind of how it is, similar to how certain teams in other markets and other sports, you may not attract big name free agents to kind of take something else. So FCD is growing for sure. It's just going to be very, very gradual. And that's why I also think 2026 is hugely important for not only all the teams in MLS, but also for FC Dallas.
Yeah, and David, Dynamo and Dash just went through a rebrand, which we've seen that move by lots of MLS teams around. But is that all it takes, or what is it going to take for Houston and to kind of become that local soccer market that everyone thinks it could one day become?
Well, I think it is a great a local soccer market, but again, I think soccer fans are educated where to get their information, right? So they are going
Right.
elsewhere to find their soccer coverage. I used to be in the sports radio world, and sports radio world is really all about football, and then maybe the NBA or MLB if something big is happening, right? When I lived in Dallas, the Stars weren't on the radio very often, like at least on conventional sports talk, the ticket will say. So it really is the fans that go to those places are looking to talk about the Cowboys, not about here in Houston, the Texans. They're not looking to talk about the Dynamo. That's unfortunate. That's just the way it is. But fans that do care about that stuff, they go to the striker. They will go to soccer specific websites because they've been trained to do that. I think for our perspective, there's a couple things that have to happen. We get 3 minutes to tell all of our sports. And in that, we have to make a decision what makes the most sense to tell the biggest stories. And sometimes that does not include the Dynamo and Dash. Sometimes it does. I look for the opportunities to bring them on because I know they're underserved. But also, I think there's apathy in this town towards the Dynamo because they haven't won in a very long time. They have not spent money, and fans are not convinced that a rebrand and changing of the shield is going to change the product on the field. There was a huge step in signing Tab Ramos to their head coach last year. That was a huge step. And they've brought in some guys this year that is, if you're a soccer fan, but like my mom doesn't know who these guys are. Like as much as we may know, these aren't huge names. If the Dynamo brought in Sergio Aguero, we all on this panel know who that is. A lot of people in Houston don't know. And I think Houston's going to have to at some point bring in, they're going to have to win, and they're going to have to bring in a name that people recognize to bring the buzz back. And they do want to see ownership put a little bit more emphasis on the roster.
Yeah. Johanna, something that David said, I think kind of brings me back to you, which is that, he says soccer fans know where to go for the information. They know to go to the striker. They know to go to the outlets that are, going to feed them the information they're looking for. And I know you, I saw you tweeting yesterday about, the world indoors and, track and field world. And I know you're really into that. How similar is that? And just the behavior of fans in sort of these sports that maybe don't fall into traditional categories for one reason or another. How willing are they to go seek outlets like us out to give them the news that they're looking for? And how have you experienced that both as a fan and as a somebody in the media?
Yeah, as Chris was sort of alluding to, I actually have spent a lot of my career as a freelance journalist and in staff capacities at different places, covering track and field and cross country and marathons and road racing. So it's kind of funny because here in the U.S. we're in starting the striker, we're talking about soccer being like a niche sport, but like it's really not. There's so many soccer fans. It's the most popular sport in the world. It's really just here in America that it gets overlooked in favor of football, basketball, etc. But yeah, and covering track and field. So I worked for a company called Flow Sports. I was the editor of Mile Split, and I worked at Flow Track, which are if you participate in track and field at the high school level, at the college level, you know about these sites. And it's so small that there's really a handful of sites. And if you participate in the sport and you start to follow the sport, I can't even tell you the genesis of it. I guess for Mile Split, it's because it keeps track of all your stats as an athlete. And then the editorial plan is, it's in addition to providing stats and results for local athletes, it also covers the elite side of the sport. And then from there, you get into Flow Track, which is covering track and cross country at the college and the professional level. So once you start participating, you become aware of these different levels of the sport. And then there's a number of other sites as well. But yeah, I mean, I would say, talk about a hardcore fan base. I think the rise of Twitter has been really great as well because, if there's a meet on TV, everyone's tweeting about it. You can find other accounts that way. But it's definitely true. You're not going to the local newspaper to find the in-depth content about some of these smaller sports because you just know more likely than not it's not going to be there. However, I will say, there's often I've read a lot of great feature stories about some of these niche sport athletes in newspapers, and sometimes they are the subjects of TV segments, right? So, and those do get passed along as well. I'm on a number of newsletters and different kind of aggregator accounts that do show that content, and often I would say some of the higher quality feature content does end up coming from traditional media outlets. So I would like to emphasize that. But yeah, to answer your question, you do, as a fan of a smaller sport, just become aware of like the really focused outlets that cover it.
Right. But bringing in that casual fan and making them care and making them, get into the sport. Jason, we've heard World Cups mentioned. I know you were here for the 94 World Cup. Johanna talked about the 99 World Cup being a watershed moment for her. For Tommy, it was 2002. For me, it was 2006. We've all kind of had an entryway, and 2026 is going to be, I think, huge for the sport in this country. I'll start with you, Jason. How much did you witness, because you were already into soccer at that point, how much did you witness, people becoming aware and getting into the sport through the 94 World Cup? What did mainstream media coverage look like? And then kind of looking ahead to 2026, how similar or different do you think that'll be, just with the media climate and everything on top of the fact that we've got a World Cup coming to the United States, Mexico, and Canada in 5 years?
Well, I mean, the beauty of the sport at this point, whether it's internationally or, as David was saying, watching the Real Madrid game, is you can find it everywhere. I mean, it's streaming. There's no, I can watch German first league match for, Bundesliga matches now every day. I mean, every weekend if I wanted to. Growing up, my first World Cup experience was the '86 Cup. And we taped the Mexican, the Spanish stations games in order to watch it after school. So, it started out as it's weird for me to kind of unpeel all of this because it's been such a big part of my life. But I will say anecdotally, the proliferation, and Tommy touched on this, the proliferation of the Premier League and being on NBC and NBC Sports, the beauty of that sport is that it's shown during the day. And there are no other sports being played on a Tuesday at 2. And I can flip it on my TV and watch it, or watch it stream online. There's nothing else to keep me, away from that if I'm not working. Of course, if you're a sports editor, it is work. So I think just having that as an option that's not going up against football, that's not going up against baseball, that's not going up against basketball at times, has really filled the space for the sports fan. And, as my kids age, and I've got one that's in college and 2 that are younger, just to see their friends pick up the sport and how easy it is for those kids to watch games where, obviously I'm dating myself. We just didn't have that.
Yeah, for sure. And, Tommy, it looks like Dallas, Arlington specifically could be one of the host cities for that 2026 World Cup. How do you think that changes soccer coverage leading into that and coming out of it for the Dallas Morning News? I know that that's 5 years away, but, how can you sort of think about what that might look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. DFW has been home to so many huge events over the years. Obviously, we've had Super Bowls. We literally just had the World Series here. We had the first college football playoff final, and you definitely see kind of heightened interest around the area. Now, if we've got Switzerland and Senegal playing here at the Cotton Bowl, probably not going to be as much interest as you would if there was a South American, Central American team playing. But it will be there'll be a bit of a fever pitch, and it's already kind of started. If not for the pandemic, I imagine we would have had some more kind of business side of the World Cup stories start to crop up. And so it's, we're 5 years away, but the run up is going now. And so particularly like in Olympic cycles where after the Winter Olympics, you look ahead to the Summer Olympics, and even though it's 2 years away, you can kind of start to identify some of the key players. I do think that by the time 2024 begins, that there will be more stories, more interest, and again, it's huge economic factors in these markets. Again, as anyone can tell you on this call, whenever a team is successful, there's a trickle down in different types of stories, not only fun features, fan features, but the economics of it. And as soccer grows, so does the stakes. It's a reason why we cover the Cowboys so much, is they're the most popular brand in America. There's so much money behind it. There's a watchdog element to that. As FC Dallas, as the Dynamo, as even smaller teams like the Dallas Wings grow, there's more of a need to cover that again from the stakes, and the stakes will be incredibly high in 2026 as well as the years leading up to it.
Yeah, I guess what do you have to add, David? What do you think about not just the Men's World Cup, but the Women's World Cup? We just had the 2019 Women's World Cup. The Dash came out of that and won the NWSL Challenge Cup. How much do these big tournaments and the fact that one will be here in 2026, how do you see that affecting the local teams? And what do these local teams have to do to drive more interest, so that we are seeing them show up more often on your newscasts or in the newspaper and stuff like that? What do you think about the World Cup and how that plays a role?
So, I've seen it a couple of times here with the men's and the women's World Cup, where there's a little a jump in the excitement level behind the team. I remember when Carly Lloyd was with the Dash and she was dominating on the world stage. That was really a big deal. And then it died down again, right? So there was up and then back to a down. I think soccer has a responsibility, the local teams, I should say, to kind of capitalize on that. How do you capitalize on that? That's the million-dollar question, because I know they've all tried things, but to keep that going and keep us engaged with it. I do think in 2026, you're going to see a ramp up. I think Houston's going to be in the mix for a host city as well. You're going to see a ramp up in human interest stories and attention towards people coming to Houston, to Dallas, to this area to see it grow. But at the end of the day, I think it's our kids. They're going to make a difference, right? Like, you're not going to change 40-year-old guy who's been an NFL fan his whole life that often. Like, my story is not very common, I think, in the soccer world, that they all of a sudden change and like this is their sport. But I do think people like my kids have grown up with soccer being cool. They've grown up with, sports on the bottom line on ESPN. We didn't have that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, right? So I think we're going to see some of the difference when 2026 comes up, because I keep bringing up my children, for example, but I have 12-year-old boys. When the World Cup comes, they're going to be almost 18, right? And they're going to have a different voice and a different buying power. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. So we're going to see the evolution right before our eyes as this World Cup comes, in my opinion.
Yeah. And, Johanna, I'll come back to you. The future of soccer coverage, until we see, sports, soccer leading Sports Center, or, soccer, MLS, on the front of the sports pages on a consistent basis, up there with, everybody else, even if that happens or whether that happens at all. How do you think the striker Texas kind of plays a role in shaping the future of soccer coverage in this state? And then we'll kind of go around the horn and talk about how, what we think of, whether it will catch up or whether it's going to be up to outlets like ours to sort of carry the torch forward.
Yeah, I think the best thing that we can do, and again, I'm going to come back to a comment that David said earlier, when sometimes if he does do a soccer story, it just doesn't get that much social engagement. I think if we can kind of pick up the slack there, create more awareness, create new fans of the sport, who then in turn seek out more soccer coverage through traditional news outlets. And then maybe next time David does a news hit on a soccer team, those people have been converted into bigger fans and engage more. I think that is the best thing, that we can do to kind of spread the soccer love throughout the whole media community.
Can I jump in real quick on that
Yeah, go
whole
ahead.
thing? Because
Yeah.
I feel like I hear from people like, hey, how come you didn't cover this story, or why you didn't do this? Like, I feel like we hear from three people. It's always like three. And it's the same thing. How come you didn't? But it's never thank you for. And I'm not saying that we need a thank
Oh
you.
yeah, of
I'm not,
course.
but because we don't. We're supposed to tell these stories. Like, I look forward to telling these stories, but it's always, like we do these stories. I just think sometimes people are looking for the when we don't. And so I'm not going to tell the story of the backup left back that the Dynamo signed if I have some breaking news going on. It's just not going to happen. So sorry. Go ahead.
No,
Yeah.
that's a good point.
No,
And
no,
I
for
think that,
sure.
we can, yeah, what can, I guess that's a good point. What can fans do to sort of show that, these two teams do deserve coverage, or they, that they will support that coverage, and I think that that's one thing that I think we're going to have to overcome as well at the Striker is, getting fans to not only buy into what we're doing, but to really buy in and to, engage on a day-to-day basis. But, how do you kind of experience that, I guess, Tommy and Jason, at the newspaper, and what gets coverage and what doesn't, based on audience and, fan interaction and feedback?
Yeah, if I may jump in there. So I think the Striker model is fantastic. The more legitimate news sites that are charging for content, the better, because audience needs to pay for real news that is putting the work in. Rise of sites like The Athletic, the Striker can let people know that, hey, this isn't just something you can get for free if you want it to be good. So by people literally paying you and saying, yes, this is worthy of my viewership, my money, my hard-earned cash, then they can let you know what they're reading. And there's more analytic tracking programs than ever now, so we can literally tell who is paying for what, and that can help our editorial decisions. It's not always just, hey, this story got X amount of page views and X amount of subscribers, we need to do something similar like that. But there's enough trends, enough things you can recognize to kind of show, why are people subscribing? Is it because they love reading about FC Dallas? Is it because they love about reading Reggie Cannon? Is it because they only love the stories when they win? Things like that. And so there's more tools to help us, but the number one thing is kind of knowing what the audience is reading and then paying for. That's what they value, which is why we have, 3 dedicated Cowboys writers and dedicated Cowboys bloggers, just because we know that's what people want. And it's why we do not have a full-time FC Dallas writer. But again, if that starts going a lot better, I'm going to come and raid you guys for basically all of you. So don't worry.
Yeah, Jason, what do you have anything to add on that front?
I guess your question is, see, to me, and David touched on this, it's not going to be my generation or even you and JoJo's generation that pushes the readership forward. It's going to be our kids. And
Yeah.
that soccer now is just another sport to them. It's not like this minor league thing that is behind, the big four, if that's what you want to call it. And I'm with Tommy. We have to figure out what people are reading and give them more of that. But here we're also trying to figure out, okay, what could they read? I know that's a big kind of leap of faith, but to attract new readers, you have to start producing stuff that, okay, what could new readers read? Not what are our current readers reading, and let's give them more of that. So it's almost a leap of faith when you're going into soccer coverage at this point. But for us, all the signs, the flags, the wind, dictates to me as a sports editor is that we need to cover this space. I mean, of course, personally, if it were me, I'd put soccer on the front page every day, but my readership would tell me not to at this point.
Yeah, no, and that's
Let me
fair. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, David.
I was going to piggyback on that thought, because I think one thing that we're forgetting is the MLS is a baby league. And what I mean by that is people have been fans of Pumas, Club America, Real Madrid for generations, different family lineages. And I use this example a lot of times. I grew up an Oilers fan. So the Texans love that I have it, but it's not the same kind of love that I had when the Oilers. Part of it was my youth, but part of it's because I grew up with that around, right? And if you've been a Man U fan your entire life, yeah, there's a team in Houston that you're going to root for, but do you have that same passion towards them that you have, because your grandfather made you watch it and his father made, and vice versa. So I think that is part of the equation, and it goes back to the kid point that our kids who did grow up with the Dynamo, FC Dallas, with Austin, are all going to, I believe, we'll see the needle move because of that. Because, look, Yankee fans are Yankee fans, and they could live in Boston, they can live in Houston. They are what they are because they were born that way.
Yeah. And Johanna, we both live here in Austin. We're part of sort of that younger generation, or the generation that kind of fits right into that MLS sweet spot. How much have you talked to people around town, and, what's the vibe that you get for, how it's going to be different here in Austin, having a new team and something to sort of rally around?
Yeah.
Than maybe it is in Dallas and Houston, where those teams have been around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I am glad David brought up that point, because I think it's a good point that, it's also, people think of MLS as being inferior to some of these other leagues around the world, right? So why would you care as much about, and are we talking about caring about soccer in general, or are we talking about caring about MLS soccer or USL soccer? I think the entry point sometimes to be a soccer fan is kind of difficult, because it's hard to even know which league to cheer for if you're sort of just a general fan and maybe you played, but like, okay, I want to start following this professionally. Do I need to start getting up at 6 a.m. and watching the games that are on TV that early, or if you're lucky enough to be in a city that has an MLS team, and that brings us back to Austin. And I think part of the excitement about Austin is, like, it's such a perfect city. We don't have any pro sports teams. We have the Longhorns, but it's also such a transient city that so many people who live here don't really have any connections to Texas. Like, I'm a transplant from Maryland. A lot of people I know aren't originally from Austin. And so I will go to a Longhorns game. It's fun, but I don't personally care that much if they win or lose. So the idea of having like an actual Austin pro sports team, I think, is something from my conversations with my peers, like, people are excited to like buy into. And that's why I do think Austin FC is going to have like a great success rate, at least from a fan perspective.
Yeah, and you can read all those stories at the Striker Texas, and for Johanna Gretschel, and you can also catch Austin FC coverage over at the Statesman. Jason Jarrett from the Austin American-Statesman, Tommy Magelssen at the Dallas Morning News, David Nuno at ABC 13 Houston. Thank you all for taking the time to be part of the first ever Texas Soccer Summit, and for supporting what we're doing over here at the Striker Texas. Really appreciate it, and best of luck with everything, and thank you again for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us,
Thank you, guys.
JoJo and Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
I really
Bye.
wish you would have
Good
kept your mullet, Chris, but not cut it.
I know, right? Had to cut it off. Yeah, guys. Thanks so much for hopping in here. It's been a blast.
Appreciate you guys. It was a lot of fun. Hope to do it soon.
Texas's workforce. They teach us. They inspire us. They take us to new heights. They make the things that make our lives better and open doors to a brighter tomorrow. These aren't just workers doing a job. They're people doing a job well. They keep Texas running, and that matters to you, and it matters to us. We're Texas Mutual Insurance Company, the state's #1 workers' comp provider. Every day, we're on the job with 1.5 million Texas workers. And every day, we have the same goal, getting each and every one of them home safe to their families. With safety resources, training technologies, dividends, and a total commitment to service, Texas Mutual is changing the way workers' comp works for you.